The rain fell in sheets, drumming against the metal roofs and transforming the muddy ground into a treacherous swamp. Jake Sullivan crawled on his belly through the muck, his weathered face streaked with mud, eyes locked on the row of rusted cages ahead. The stench hit him first, the unmistakable odor of neglect, disease, and death that he'd encountered too many times before. But it was the sounds that truly haunted him, the whimpers, the soft cries of pain, and the occasional desperate bark, quickly silenced. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the compound. For a split second, Jake could see them all, hundreds of German shepherds in various states of suffering. In the nearest cage, a large male with a scarred face stood protectively over 3 trembling puppies. Despite his emaciated frame, the dog's posture remained vigilant, military-trained. Their eyes met, and Jake felt a jolt of recognition he couldn't explain. "I'm coming for you," he whispered. "All of you." The crack of a gunshot echoed in the distance. Spotlight beams suddenly cut through the darkness. Sweeping across the mud, Jake froze as voices shouted commands in Russian and Ukrainian. The dog, the one he'd locked eyes with, let out a low growl. Not at Jake, but at the approaching danger. Time was running out. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake Sullivan hadn't always been a rescuer. At 42, the deep lines etched around his eyes told stories of 2 decades in Special Forces missions across hostile territories and decisions that still haunted his dreams. His broad shoulders, once proudly carrying the weight of military responsibility, now bore a different burden. The memories of service dogs abandoned during his final deployment in Afghanistan, the image of those loyal animals, left behind as equipment when evacuation orders came suddenly, drove him to establish K9 Freedom Rangers 3 years ago. The Russia-Ukraine border region wasn't his usual area of operation. K9 Freedom Rangers typically focused on shutting down dogfighting rings in the American Midwest or rescuing abandoned military working dogs. But the photos that had arrived in his secure email 2 weeks ago showing dozens of purebred German shepherds in transport cages had immediately set off alarm bells. Someone was running a sophisticated trafficking operation. And these weren't just any dogs. The markings and training responses suggested many were former military or police canines. Dr. Melissa Carter adjusted her tactical vest, feeling the weight of medical supplies pressing against her ribs. At 38, the veterinarian had built a reputation for rehabilitating the most traumatized animals. But this mission felt different, more personal. Her brother had died in Afghanistan, despite a military dog's efforts to drag him to safety. The memory fueled both her dedication and her ambivalence about working alongside Jake, whose military past remained largely mysterious to her. Brandon Walker checked his camera equipment one final time. The war correspondent had covered conflicts across 3 continents, but his own PTSD had eventually forced him off the front lines. Documenting animal rescue missions became his therapy, each successful rescue partially healing his own trauma. His weathered face, with a scar running from left eyebrow to cheekbone, rarely showed emotion except when filming reunions between rescued animals and their new families. Agent Dmitry Volkov stood apart from the others, his posture rigid as he surveyed the area with cold calculation. At 45, the border police officer had offered his assistance with surprising eagerness. His knowledge of local smuggling routes proved invaluable, but his true motivations remained unclear. Jake had learned long ago that allies in these regions often carried their own agendas, sometimes compatible with his mission, sometimes not. The anonymous tip had arrived during a thunderstorm much like tonight's. Jake had been reviewing applications for their next domestic rescue operation when his secure laptop pinged with an encrypted message. The photographs showed rows of German shepherds in various states of distress, some clearly malnourished, others bearing the distinctive marks of military training. The GPS coordinates pointed to a remote compound near the Russia-Ukraine border, a lawless region where jurisdiction was murky at best. "I've never seen an operation this size," Jake said, spreading the reconnaissance photos across the wooden table in their temporary headquarters, a rented farmhouse 20 miles from the target. "This isn't some backyard breeder or local meat farm. This is industrial." Melissa leaned forward, her trained eye cataloging visible injuries and conditions. "These dogs show signs of professional handling. See the stance on this one? The alertness despite obvious malnourishment. These were working dogs, probably stolen or sold off after service." Brandon adjusted his camera, capturing the team's reactions. "My contacts say the black market for trained military dogs has exploded since the conflict intensified. A fully trained German Shepherd can fetch upwards of $30,000 to private security firms that don't ask questions." The farmhouse door opened with a bang as Volkov entered, bringing with him the smell of cigarettes and wet leather. "Your information was correct, but incomplete," he announced, dropping a folder on the table. "There are not 20 or 30 dogs as you thought. There are at least 450. A heavy silence fell over the room. Their resources, veterinary supplies, transport vehicles, temporary kenneling were inadequate for an operation of this magnitude. They had planned for a surgical strike. This would require an army. "That's not all," Volkov continued, his accent thickening with tension. "The compound is protected by armed guards, former military contractors, and they have connections with local officials, which means no police assistance." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced in Kandahar when ordered to leave their unit's dogs behind. The nightmares had returned last night, dreaming of Sarge, his former K9 partner who'd disappeared during a firefight years ago. In the dream, as in reality, Jake had been forced to choose between searching for his dog and evacuating wounded soldiers. He'd made the right call, but the cost haunted him still. "We need to reconsider," Melissa said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking. "We're not equipped for this." Jake stood, pacing the small room. "If we walk away, what happens to them? You saw the photos. You know what those dogs are facing?" Brandon lowered his camera, his journalist's detachment slipping. "Jake, she's right. This isn't like our operations back home. This is a paramilitary compound in disputed territory. We could be walking into an international incident, or worse." "I have additional information that may help," Volkov interjected, his expression unreadable. "The compound manager follows a schedule. Tomorrow night, half the security team will be away, transporting another shipment across the border. It creates a window small, but real." Jake studied Volkov carefully. The man had appeared in their operation with suspicious convenience, offering local knowledge and connections. His help had proven valuable. But Jake's instincts, honed through years in conflict zones, warned him that the border agent had his own agenda. The question was whether that agenda aligned with their mission enough to trust him. Melissa stepped closer to Jake, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "I don't like this. His information is too perfect, too convenient." "I don't disagree," Jake whispered back. "But what choice do we have?" The following morning, Jake and Brandon conducted their own reconnaissance, using thermal imaging cameras to confirm Volkov's claims. The security pattern matched his description: regular patrols, but with noticeable gaps in coverage at the eastern perimeter. More troubling were the heat signatures, hundreds of them, packed into spaces clearly too small for humane conditions. As dusk approached, Melissa finished organizing her medical supplies, prioritizing for triage in field conditions. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind wrestled with doubts. This wasn't like her controlled veterinary environment back home. She would be making life and death decisions with limited resources and time. Dogs she might have saved in her clinic might be beyond help here. Jake found her sitting alone, staring at a photograph of her brother in uniform, his German Shepherd service dog sitting attentively beside him. "We can still abort," he said softly. "No one would blame you." Melissa tucked the photo away. "These dogs didn't choose this life. They served, just like my brother, just like you." She met his gaze with renewed determination. "We're going in." The first attempt to infiltrate the compound ended before it truly began. Jake, Melissa, and Brandon had approached from the eastern perimeter, as Volkov suggested, using the cover of darkness and a sudden rainstorm to mask their movements. They'd made it within 50 yards of the outer fence when floodlights suddenly illuminated the entire area, forcing them to retreat through muddy drainage ditches. "Someone tipped them off," Jake said, once they'd made it back to their vehicle, clothes soaked and covered in mud. "They were waiting for us." Brandon wiped rain from his camera lens, checking if he'd captured any usable footage. "The guard patterns completely changed from our reconnaissance, almost like they knew exactly when and where we'd approach." Jake's gaze shifted to Volkov, who had stayed behind to coordinate their extraction if needed. The border agent's expression remained passive, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt, but calculation. "Perhaps it is time I share more information," Volkov said, pulling a flask from his coat and taking a long drink before offering it to the others. None accepted. "The dog operation is significant. Yes, but it is also a cover." "A cover for what?" Melissa asked, wrapping a thermal blanket around her shoulders. "Weapons smuggling, biological materials, things that require controlled transport across borders without inspection." Volkov pulled out a tablet, displaying shipping manifests and inventory lists. "For 6 months, I have been building a case against this network. The dogs are merely the visible part of a much larger operation." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "You used us as a distraction." "Not exactly," Volkov said, unperturbed by the accusation. "Your presence accelerates my timeline, but our goals align. You want the dogs. I want what happens beneath the kennels." "Beneath?" Brandon asked. "There is an underground facility. The truly valuable cargo moves through there." Volkov swiped to a schematic of the compound. "Your rescue attempt, while unsuccessful, confirmed my suspicion that they have been alerted to an investigation. They are planning to move everything dogs included within 24 hours." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. 450 dogs, transported in haste, meant many wouldn't survive the journey. Those that did would be separated, distributed through networks spanning Eastern Europe and Asia. "How do you know this?" Melissa demanded, her medical training making her acutely aware of what a rushed transport would mean for animals already in distress. "I have someone inside, someone who has been providing information." Volkov paused. "Someone who recognized your face. Mr. Sullivan." Before Jake could process this information, Brandon called out from where he'd been reviewing surveillance footage on his laptop. "Jake, you need to see this." The grainy night vision footage showed one of the guards clearly, walking the perimeter with a distinctive gait Jake instantly recognized. Chris Matthews is working security there." "You know him?" Melissa asked. "Afghanistan, same unit." He was responsible for handler training before he went private contractor. Jake couldn't reconcile the image of the man he'd known dedicated to the military working dogs in his care with someone who would guard a dog meat and trafficking operation. Meanwhile, Brandon was scanning local news on his tablet. "We've got another problem. Someone posted about American animal activists operating in the border region. Local officials are warning that interference with agricultural operations will result in immediate arrest." Agricultural operations, Melissa repeated with disgust. "Is that what they're calling this?" Jake stared at the schematic Volkov had provided, mind racing through scenarios, calculating risks and probabilities as he'd been trained to do in the field. 450 dogs, 24 hours, limited resources, and now active opposition from local authorities. "We need to accelerate," he decided. "Tonight, full operation." "That's insane," Melissa protested. "We barely escaped with our lives an hour ago. We don't have backup. We don't have enough transport capacity for even half those dogs." "We have something better than backup," Jake replied, turning to Volkov. "We have inside information, don't we? Agent, your operative, the one who recognized me, they can help us get in. Can't they?" Volkov's expression revealed nothing. "Perhaps, but my mission takes priority. The evidence I need is in the sub-level facility." "Then we help each other," Jake proposed. "Your operative gets us access to the dogs. We create the distraction you need to access your evidence. We both get what we want." What Jake didn't say was that he no longer fully trusted Volkov. The man had withheld critical information, used them as pawns in his operation, but right now, their objectives aligned enough to cooperate, and Jake had learned long ago to make use of temporary alliances in hostile territory. What none of them realized yet was that Brandon's footage of their first attempt had already been uploaded to his secure cloud storage and automatic function of his custom camera equipment. Within hours, clips showing armed guards and caged German shepherds would reach his editor back in New York, creating international attention neither Jake nor Volkov had anticipated. As they prepared for the night operation, Melissa pulled Jake aside. "There's something not right about this. Everything's happening too fast." "We don't have a choice," Jake responded, checking his non-lethal equipment tranquilizer darts, cable ties, bolt cutters. "Those dogs don't have time for us to develop the perfect plan. And if it's a trap," Jake's hands stilled for a moment, "then we spring it and deal with whatever comes. But I'm not leaving those dogs behind. Not again." The words hung between them, laden with the weight of Jake's past, the choices he'd been forced to make in Afghanistan. The service dogs he couldn't save. Melissa saw in his eyes that this mission had become about more than just the German shepherds in the compound. It was about redemption, about finally making a different choice than the one that had haunted him for years. "Okay," she finally said, "but we do this smart. Maximum medical supplies, minimum confrontation. We focus on the most vulnerable dogs, first mothers, puppies, the injured. We can't save them all in one night. Jake, we have to accept that." The planning of a covert rescue operation required precision, experience, and ideally, weeks of preparation. Jake and his team had 12 hours. The farmhouse had transformed into a war room, with maps and thermal images covering every available surface. Jake had operated under worse conditions in his military days, but those missions hadn't involved the logistical challenge of extracting hundreds of traumatized animals. "We'll need transport vehicles stationed here, and here." Jake indicated on the map, marking 3 extraction points around the compound's perimeter. "Brandon, your press contacts come in handy now. How many animal transport vehicles can you secure from local shelters without raising alarms? Brandon finished a call and turned to the group. 3 vans from a shelter in Odessa. They think it's for a routine transfer of strays from a municipal pound. They'll be at the rendezvous point by midnight with basic supplies. Not enough, Melissa interjected, tallying numbers on her tablet. 3 vans might handle 60 dogs. Maximum. We're talking about 7 times that number. We focus on the most vulnerable first, Jake replied, the weight of triage decisions already heavy in his voice. Pregnant females, nursing mothers, puppies, critically injured. We document everything else for the follow-up operation. Volkov, who had been on his own phone in the corner, rejoined the group. I have arranged for 2 local farmers to provide additional transport. They have livestock trailers, not ideal, but functional. They will meet your vehicles here. He pointed to a location 3 miles from the compound. And follow instructions only from me. Jake evaluated the Russian's statement, searching for deception, finding none obvious. He nodded. That gives us capacity for perhaps 200. Still insufficient, but better. As the afternoon progressed, they were joined by 6 volunteers from local animal welfare groups. None spoke much English, but their determination transcended language barriers. Melissa briefed them using Brandon as translator, demonstrating basic animal handling techniques for frightened or aggressive dogs. Approach from the side. Never directly face on, she instructed, using one of the volunteers as a demonstration partner. Many of these dogs have military or police training. Direct eye contact is a challenge. Speak softly. Move slowly. Jake watched from across the room, struck by the contrast between Melissa's gentle movements now and the efficient way she'd field-dressed a bullet wound he'd received during a previous rescue operation. She caught him watching and held his gaze for a moment before returning to her demonstration. "Why are you doing this?" Jake had asked her once, months ago. "You could have a comfortable practice anywhere in the States." "The same reason you are," she'd answered simply. "Because someone has to." Now, as he observed her preparing civilians for what would undoubtedly be a traumatic night, he was reminded why he'd asked her to join K-9 Freedom Rangers in the first place. Her compassion never compromised her competence. By early evening, the final preparations were underway. Melissa had converted one of the farm's outbuildings into a triage center, arranging veterinary supplies with military precision. Brandon tested his night vision equipment and secured backup batteries for everything. The volunteers loaded transport crates and medical supplies into the vehicles. Working silently and efficiently, Jake found himself standing alone at the edge of the property, watching the sun set behind distant mountains. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, not just for the dogs they hoped to save, but for the people who had joined this mission. If things went wrong, the consequences would be severe. "Second thoughts." Volkov's voice came from behind him. "Realistic assessment." Jake corrected without turning. "These operations go sideways more often than not. That is why contingency plans exist." Volkov moved to stand beside him, lighting a cigarette. "My contact inside will ensure the eastern gate guards are occupied at 0100 hours. That gives you a 15-minute window to breach the perimeter. I will create an additional distraction at the main entrance at 0115, claiming a routine border patrol inspection. And while we're moving dogs, you'll access the sub-level facility." Volkov exhaled smoke. "We each have our missions. Just remember, those dogs aren't collateral damage. They're the priority. For you, perhaps." Volkov's expression remained impassive. "I have pursued this network for 3 years. Mr. Sullivan, Dogs are only part of what moves through these smuggling routes. Weapons, drugs, sometimes people. Keep your perspective." Before Jake could respond, Brandon approached, his camera already recording. "Local news," he said grimly. Holding up his phone, the screen showed shaky footage of their aborted approach from the previous night. Clearly filmed by compound security cameras, a news anchor spoke in Ukrainian, with English subtitles, "American extremists attempting to steal valuable breeding stock from licensed kennel." "They're getting ahead of the story," Brandon explained, taking back his phone. "Painting us as criminals before we've even made a move. It changes nothing," Jake decided. "If anything, it confirms we need to move tonight before they've fully prepared for us." As darkness fell, the team gathered for final instructions. Jake had changed into black tactical gear, his face darkened with camo paint. Similar attire had been provided for everyone, creating a visual uniformity that belied their disparate backgrounds. "We move in 3 teams," Jake explained, indicating positions on the map. "Brandon, you'll lead Team Alpha with 2 volunteers, focusing on the northeastern kennels. Melissa, you take Team Bravo with 3 volunteers for the main kennel block. I'll take Charlie Team to the isolation kennels where they likely keep new arrivals and sick animals." "What about me?" asked a young Ukrainian volunteer, her English heavily accented but determined. "You'll coordinate transportation," Melissa answered. "As we extract dogs, we'll relay numbers and conditions. You'll direct each group to the appropriate vehicle based on their needs, critical cases to the medical transport, mothers and puppies together in the climate-controlled vans." Jake continued. "Communication is via secure radio only. 1 click means danger freeze. 2 clicks means proceed. 3 rapid clicks means abort. Everyone returns to vehicles immediately." He looked each person in the eye. "We're not heroes. We're professionals. No risks for single animals. If a dog is too aggressive to handle safely, mark the cage and move on. We'll come back with specialized equipment." "What about security personnel?" one of the volunteers asked. "Non-engagement is our primary protocol," Jake emphasized. "If confronted, surrender immediately. Brandon's press credentials give us some protection, and Volkov has contingencies for legal intervention." What Jake didn't mention was the tranquilizer gun holstered against his leg, or the ceramic knife in his boot. Some contingencies weren't for public disclosure. As the team dispersed for final preparations, Melissa approached Jake privately. "I've been studying the medical supply inventories we found in their shipping manifests," she said, voice low. "Jake, they're not just trafficking these dogs for security contracts or meat. There's surgical equipment, experimental compounds. I think they're using them for testing." Jake's jaw tightened. "Testing what?" "I can't be certain, but some of these pharmaceutical codes match experimental combat stimulants, the kind that militaries research for enhanced soldier performance, using dogs as test subjects," Jake concluded grimly. "All the more reason to shut them down tonight." The convoy departed at 2300 hours. Traveling separate routes to avoid drawing attention, Jake rode alone in the lead vehicle, using the solitude to center himself before the operation. The methodology was familiar: assess, plan, execute, but the stakes felt intensely personal, perhaps because German shepherds had been his partners throughout his military career, perhaps because each operation like this partially atoned for those he couldn't save in Afghanistan. They established the forward operating base in an abandoned barn 2 miles from the compound. From here, each team would proceed on foot to their assigned entry points. Equipment was distributed, radios tested, Final questions addressed. "Remember," Jake said as they prepared to move out, "these dogs may not react as you expect. Some will be terrified, others aggressive. Some may have been conditioned to distrust humans entirely. Move confidently but carefully. If you're bitten, signal for assistance but do not abandon your position." The approach to the compound was conducted in staggered intervals, teams departing 10 minutes apart to minimize visible movement. Jake led Charlie team through a dried-up stream bed that offered cover almost to the southern perimeter, where intelligence suggested the isolation kennels were located. At precisely 00:55, all teams were in position. Jake gave the go signal, and the operation commenced. Volkov's intelligence proved accurate. The eastern gate guards were indeed distracted. Arguing with what appeared to be a delivery driver, Brandon's team was first across the perimeter, disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Melissa's team followed 3 minutes later, using the cover of a sudden downpour to mask their movement. Jake's team was halfway to the isolation kennels when the first complication arose. The kennel door, shown as unlocked in their intelligence, was secured with a new padlock. Precious minutes ticked by as Jake worked to pick it, rain dripping down his neck and thunder masking the metallic clicks of his tools. The lock finally gave way at 01:07. Inside, the team was hit by the overwhelming stench of neglect and disease. Dim emergency lighting revealed rows of cages, most containing German shepherds in various states of distress. Unlike the main kennels they'd observed during reconnaissance, these dogs showed visible signs of experimentation, shaved patches for intravenous access, surgical scars, some with monitoring equipment still attached. Jake swallowed his rage, channeling it into methodical action. "Start with the critical cases," he instructed his team, moving to the first row of cages. "Document everything." The dogs' reactions varied dramatically. Some cowered at the back of their cages. Others lunged aggressively. A few, those who perhaps remembered human kindness from their former service lives, approached cautiously, noses working to identify these strange humans in black clothing. In the third cage, Jake found what appeared to be a former military working dog, its tattoo still visible in its ear despite attempts to burn it out. The dog, a male German shepherd with a graying muzzle, watched Jake with an intensity that seemed almost like recognition. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, carefully opening the cage door. "We're getting you out of here." Instead of showing fear or aggression, the dog stood calmly, allowing Jake to slip a lead around his neck. As they moved toward the exit, the dog suddenly stopped, pulling toward a row of smaller cages Jake's team hadn't reached yet. "We'll get to them," Jake assured, gently tugging the lead, but the dog insisted, pulling with surprising strength toward one particular cage. Inside were 3 shepherd puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, huddled together in obvious distress. Their cage showed signs of recent medical testing, syringes and vials on a small table beside it. Jake understood immediately. This older dog had been protecting them somehow, perhaps sharing his food or simply providing comfort through proximity. Pack behavior, survival instinct, whatever it was, Jake wouldn't separate them. "Change of plan," he radioed to his team. "Priority extraction for cage E7. Adult male and 3 puppies." As the first dogs were being moved to the extraction point, Melissa's voice came over the radio, tense but controlled. "Bravo team reporting. Main kennel conditions worse than anticipated. At least 40 dogs need immediate medical intervention. Many appear drugged, requesting additional medical transport." Jake made the difficult call. "Maintain protocol. Critical cases first, then puppies and nursing mothers. Document everything else." "Copy that," Melissa acknowledged, the strain in her voice evident even through the static. Brandon's team reported similar findings from the northeastern kennels, with the additional complication of finding multiple breeds beyond German Shepherds, Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, and even Labradors, all breeds commonly used in military and police work. At 0115 precisely, floodlights suddenly illuminated the main entrance as Volkov initiated his distraction. Jake could hear the border agent's authoritative voice demanding inspection access, creating the promised diversion. So far, the operation was proceeding according to plan. Jake continued working through the isolation kennel, moving methodically from cage to cage. The older German Shepherd stayed close beside him, occasionally whining softly when they encountered dogs in particularly bad condition. If Jake hadn't known better, he would have thought the dog was helping to identify the most vulnerable cases. "This one's not going to make it," one of the volunteers whispered, kneeling beside a cage containing a severely emaciated female. "She's barely breathing." Jake joined him, assessing the situation with the detachment years of field medicine had taught him. The dog's condition was indeed critical dehydration, infected wounds, signs of internal bleeding under normal circumstances. Euthanasia would be the humane choice, but something in the dog's eyes, a stubborn spark of life, despite everything, made Jake hesitate. "Tag her for immediate medical transport. Melissa will make the call." The volunteer looked doubtful but followed instructions, attaching a red tag to the cage before moving on. By 0130, the first groups of dogs had reached the transport vehicles and were being loaded under the supervision of the Ukrainian coordinator. Progress was steady but slower than planned, each animal requiring individual handling, each cage presenting unique challenges. Jake was preparing to move a particularly aggressive dog when his radio crackled with Brandon's voice. Urgency overriding protocol. "Charlie team, we've got a situation. Security personnel approaching from the north armed, at least 6 individuals." Jake's mind raced through contingencies. Maintain position. Continue extraction, if confronted. Brandon shows press credentials. Claims journalistic investigation. "Copy that," Brandon replied, sounding unconvinced. Jake turned to the volunteer beside him. "Accelerate extraction from this sector. I'm going to reinforce Alpha Team." Moving swiftly between buildings, Jake approached the northeastern kennels from behind, using the continuing rainfall as cover. He could hear raised voices, Brandon attempting to engage with security personnel in a mix of English and broken Ukrainian. The scene came into view as Jake rounded the corner of a storage building. Brandon stood with hands raised, camera prominently displayed, while 2 volunteers continued loading dogs into transport crates behind him. 6 men in paramilitary uniforms had formed a semicircle, weapons not yet raised but clearly ready. Jake assessed options rapidly. Direct confrontation would endanger everyone. Retreat would mean abandoning Brandon and the volunteers. A distraction was needed. The decision was made for him when the older German Shepherd, who had somehow followed him from the isolation kennels, suddenly darted forward, placing himself between Brandon and the security personnel. The dog didn't bark or growl. He simply stood, tail high, posture alert but not aggressive. One of the guards reacted with visible shock, lowering his weapon slightly. "Commandant," he said in heavily accented English, using what was clearly a name rather than a rank. The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound. In that moment of confusion, Volkov's promised distraction at the main entrance escalated dramatically. The sound of vehicles arriving at high speed, followed by authoritative shouting in both Russian and Ukrainian, drew the attention of the security personnel. "Border Authority inspection," came Volkov's amplified voice. "All personnel to the main entrance immediately." The guards hesitated, looking between Brandon and the commotion at the main gate. Finally, the one who appeared to be in charge barked an order, and they retreated toward the main compound, leaving Brandon and his team unharmed. Jake emerged from cover once they'd gone. "What just happened?" Brandon lowered his hands, looking equally confused. "I have no idea. They were about to detain us when your dog showed up and that guard recognized him." "He's not my dog," Jake clarified, though the older German shepherd had returned to his side, pressing against his leg as if they'd been partners for years. "But I think he might be someone important around here. Whatever he is, he just saved this part of the operation," Brandon replied, returning to the urgent task of dog extraction. By 0200, approximately 120 dogs had been successfully moved to transport vehicles, with another 30 in process. Progress was steady, but the numbers confirmed Jake's earlier assessment they couldn't save them all tonight. The difficult reality of triage decisions weighed heavily as teams prioritized which animals to take and which to leave behind. Each cage, left marked but unopened, represented a promise to return. But Jake knew that promise might prove impossible to keep once the alarm was fully raised. The operation continued through the early morning hours, a race against time and discovery that would test the limits of their planning, their resources, and ultimately, their conviction that what they were doing, trespassing, theft in the eyes of local law, was unquestionably right. The thunderstorm that had provided cover for their infiltration intensified as the rescue operation reached its climax. Lightning illuminated the compound in stark flashes, revealing the full scale of what they'd discovered: hundreds of German shepherds in conditions that defied humane description. The rain had turned the ground into mud soup, making the transport of crates and carriers increasingly difficult. Jake led his team through the maze of buildings, guided by Volkov's intelligence and the strange behavior of the older German shepherd who had attached himself to Jake's side. The dog, whom Jake had started mentally calling Sarge after the partner he'd lost in Afghanistan, seemed to know the compound intimately, often pulling toward specific buildings or kennels containing the most distressed animals. "Team Bravo reports main kennel block now 50% cleared," came Melissa's voice over the radio, breathless but determined. "Encountering resistance at the western edge. 2 guards, unarmed but obstructive. Maintain non-engagement," Jake responded. "Withdraw to completed sections if necessary." The radio crackled again, this time with Brandon's voice. "Alpha team discovers underground access. Repeat. We've found entrance to sublevel facility. Appears to be veterinary surgical suite." Evidence of extensive operations. Jake's blood ran cold. Melissa's suspicions about testing appeared correct, and on a larger scale than anticipated. Document everything. No physical evidence collection, that's Volkov's jurisdiction. Speaking of the border agent, Volkov's diversionary inspection at the main entrance had evolved into what sounded like a full administrative confrontation. Jake could hear raised voices, demands for documentation, the distinct sound of bureaucratic obstruction being deployed as tactical weaponry. Volkov was buying them time, but Jake knew it wouldn't last indefinitely. "All teams accelerate extraction," he ordered. "Priority shift to documentation of remaining areas. We've got maybe 30 minutes before this whole operation goes sideways." As if fate had heard his warning, a new complication materialized from the rain-soaked darkness. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the compound, bypassing Volkov's inspection point entirely through some unseen secondary entrance. It parked directly outside the main administrative building, and 4 men emerged, 3 with the unmistakable bearing of private security, and one in a tailored suit. Despite the hour and weather, Jake ducked behind a stack of supply crates, signaling his team to freeze. Sarge pressed against his leg, a low growl building in his throat as he stared at the new arrivals. The suited man walked with authority, barely acknowledging the rain soaking through his expensive clothing, even at a distance. Something about his gait struck Jake as familiar, the slight favor to the right leg, the squared shoulders of military bearing not quite concealed by civilian attire. When the man turned to address the security personnel, Jake caught his profile in a flash of lightning, and the recognition hit him like a physical blow. Colonel Richard Hargrove, Jake's former commanding officer in Afghanistan, the man who had given the evacuation order that forced Jake to leave the unit's dogs behind. "Continue extraction," Jake whispered to his team. "I need to follow this development." Leaving his team to their work, Jake slipped through the shadows toward the administrative building, Sarge silent beside him. Years of special operations training allowed him to move undetected, using the storm as cover, pausing during lightning flashes that might expose his position. He reached a window at the rear of the building just as Hargrove and his security detail entered what appeared to be an office. The window was cracked open slightly, probably for ventilation in the stifling summer heat, before the storm broke, allowing fragments of conversation to reach Jake's ears. Timeline accelerated. "The Ukrainian authorities are asking questions we don't want to answer." Hargrove's voice, unchanged from Jake's memory, carried the same authoritative tone. "Load the primary subjects for transport immediately. The rest are now a liability." "And the testing data?" asked another voice. "Already secured. The protocols have been validated sufficiently for Phase 2. We no longer need this facility." The implications were clear. They were planning to abandon the compound, and the fate of the remaining dogs would be grim. What had been a rescue operation was now a race against execution. Jake retreated from the window, mind racing through scenarios and options. The revelation of Hargrove's involvement explained much about the operation's sophistication, but raised disturbing questions about who was truly behind this facility. Private contractors were one thing, former high-ranking U.S. military officers operating a dog trafficking and experimental testing facility was another entirely. His radio crackled. "Charlie, team leader. This is Bravo. We have a situation." Melissa's voice was tight with controlled panic. "They're moving dogs from the main kennel to some kind of processing room. It doesn't look like transport preparation." Before Jake could respond, gunfire erupted from the direction of the main entrance, the sound of Volkov's diversion collapsing into confrontation. "All teams, accelerate extraction. Emergency Protocol Alpha," Jake ordered, using their prearranged code for imminent threat. "Melissa, intercept those dogs if possible, but maintain personal safety as priority." Jake moved toward the main kennel block, but Sarge suddenly pulled in the opposite direction, toward a nondescript building they hadn't yet explored. The dog's urgency was unmistakable, teeth gently but firmly gripping Jake's sleeve, pulling him away from his planned route. In Afghanistan, Jake had learned to trust his canine partner's instincts. He followed Sarge now, staying low as more security personnel emerged from various buildings, drawn by the commotion at the main entrance. Sarge led him to a small structure set apart from the main compound, its metal door secured with an electronic keypad. The dog pawed at the door, whining softly. Jake examined the lock, recognizing the military-grade security system. Breaking through would take time he didn't have and would certainly trigger alarms. But Sarge's behavior suggested something or someone important was inside. A flash of intuition hit him. Jake entered the 6-digit date of his deployment to Kandahar, the mission where everything had gone wrong. The The keypad flashed green, and the lock disengaged with a soft click. Inside, the building was clinically sterile white walls, stainless steel examination tables, and sophisticated monitoring equipment. But what froze Jake in place were the kennels lining the far wall, each containing a German Shepherd with distinctive markings Jake had seen before. These weren't just any military dogs. These were the dogs from his unit in Afghanistan, the ones he'd been ordered to leave behind. Dogs presumed dead or lost years ago. Each wore a collar with a small monitoring device, and charts outside their kennels displayed experimental protocols and results. In the center kennel, a large shepherd with a distinctive scar across its muzzle stood watching Jake. Despite the years that had passed, Jake recognized him instantly. "Sarge," he whispered, looking between the dog in the kennel and the one beside him. For a confused moment, he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. The dog in the kennel gave a soft whine of recognition. The truth crashed into Jake like a physical blow. The dog who had guided him through the compound wasn't Sarge at all, but another former military working dog who had somehow recognized Jake, perhaps from shared deployments or training exercises. The real Sarge. Jake's former partner had been here all along. The implications were staggering. Hargrove hadn't just abandoned these dogs. He had deliberately acquired them for whatever experiments were being conducted here. The betrayal went far deeper than Jake had imagined. As Jake processed this revelation, his radio erupted with urgent communications from all teams. Brandon's team had been cornered in the northeast section by armed security. Melissa reported that dogs were being loaded onto unmarked trucks on the western perimeter. The Ukrainian volunteers at the extraction point warned that local police vehicles were approaching their position. The operation was collapsing around them. Jake forced himself to focus through the shock and rage. He quickly located the kennel release mechanisms and began freeing the dogs. Starting with Sarge, years of captivity and experimentation had clearly taken their toll. Some dogs moved stiffly. Others seemed disoriented, but their training held. They responded to basic commands. Following Jake toward the door, outside, the compound had erupted into chaos. The confrontation at the main entrance had escalated, with Volkov now engaged in what sounded like a firefight with compound security. Floodlights swept the grounds, and the sound of vehicles revving added to the crescendo of the storm. "All teams report." Jake ordered into his radio, receiving fragmented responses indicating that most of his people were retreating toward extraction points with as many dogs as they could manage. "Jake, they're heading your way," Melissa warned, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Hargrove and a security team, moving toward the special kennels." Jake had moments to make a decision. The narrow path between buildings offered minimal cover, especially with 8 former military dogs now clustered around him. The extraction point was 200 yards away, across open ground, now swept by searchlights. As he weighed options, the administrative building's door burst open, and Hargrove emerged with 4 armed security personnel. They were heading directly toward Jake's position. Jake pressed himself against the wall, but he knew discovery was inevitable. The dogs, despite years of captivity, instinctively formed a protective formation around him. Military training, overriding fear. Hargrove stopped 20 feet away, rain soaking his expensive suit, expression shifting from urgency to shock as he registered the scene before him. Jake Sullivan, surrounded by dogs that should have been secured in the special kennel. "Sullivan," he said, recovering quickly. "Always the sentimental one. I wondered if you'd eventually track them down." "These dogs were declared lost in action," Jake replied. keeping his voice steady despite the rage boiling inside him. "Their handlers were told they died serving their country, and they have continued to serve," Hargrove countered, "contributing to advancements that will save countless soldier lives. A noble purpose. By being test subjects, there's nothing noble about torture." Hargrove signaled his security team to spread out, creating a half-circle around Jake and the dogs. "The world isn't as black and white as you'd like it to be, Sullivan. These animals have unique physiological responses to stress and combat stimuli, responses that, when properly understood, can help us develop protocols to prevent PTSD in human soldiers. By inducing it in dogs," Jake said, disgust evident in his voice. "Dogs who already served honorably." The standoff stretched between them, punctuated by thunder and the distant sound of conflict from other areas of the compound. Jake knew his position was untenable, outgunned, exposed, with no clear escape route, but the alternative, surrendering these dogs back to Hargrove's experiments, was unthinkable. The decision was taken from him when the real Sarge suddenly lunged forward, not toward Hargrove but toward one of the security personnel who had shifted his weapon into firing position. The dog's training, identifying and neutralizing threats remained intact despite years of captivity. His attack created momentary chaos in the security team's formation. Simultaneously, a deafening explosion rocked the main entrance area, sending everyone diving for cover. Through the smoke and rain, Jake saw Volkov's distinctive silhouette, now joined by what appeared to be official reinforcements, border patrol vehicles with lights flashing. The compound was being raided not just by Jake's rescue team, but by legitimate authorities. Brandon's live stream, Jake realized, the footage had reached the outside world faster than anticipated, forcing official action, taking advantage of the confusion. Jake issued a sharp command, a specific whistle pattern taught to military working dogs for emergency evacuation scenarios. All 8 shepherds responded instantly, moving as a coordinated unit toward the nearest cover. Hargrove shouted orders to his security team, but they were now caught between Jake's position and the advancing border patrol. Prioritizing their employer's safety, they began retreating toward the black SUV. "This isn't over, Sullivan," Hargrove called out as he was hustled toward the vehicle. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I know exactly what I'm interfering with," Jake replied, though the rain and chaos likely swallowed his words. "And it ends tonight." As Hargrove's SUV sped away through a back exit, Jake led the dogs toward the extraction point, radioing ahead to coordinate with the transport team. The operation had transformed from a covert rescue into a very public confrontation, with all the complications that entailed. But one thing was certain: the dogs surrounding him, including his long-lost partner Sarge, would not be returning to their cages. Whatever came next, whatever consequences awaited, that core mission had been accomplished. The real fight for justice, for accountability, for the hundreds of dogs still missing was just beginning. The aftermath of battle brought its own kind of silence. As dawn broke over the compound, the full tragedy of what they'd uncovered became painfully visible. Melissa worked tirelessly in the makeshift triage center they'd established at the extraction point, her face drawn with exhaustion as she moved from one critical case to the next. Dozens of dogs lay on emergency blankets, receiving IV fluids, pain medication, and the first gentle touches many had felt in years. "We're losing this one," she murmured to Jake, kneeling beside a young female shepherd with infected wounds covering much of her body. Internal bleeding, severe malnutrition, probable organ failure. I've given her pain relief, but—" Her voice trailed off as she stroked the dog's head gently. The dog's eyes, clouded with suffering but still somehow trusting, locked onto Melissa's face. "Make her comfortable," Jake said softly. "She deserves that much." The decision to euthanize was never easy, but sometimes it was the only mercy they could offer. Jake had seen enough battlefield triage to know when recovery wasn't possible. Still, each loss felt like a personal failure. A life they should have saved if only they'd arrived sooner. Across the field hospital, Brandon documented everything: the injuries, the conditions, the procedures, his camera capturing evidence that would eventually reach authorities far beyond this border region. His expression remained professionally detached, but Jake had seen him step away several times when the reality became too overwhelming, returning moments later with reddened eyes and renewed determination. 23 euthanized so far, Brandon reported quietly. 48 critical but stable. Over 100 with significant injuries requiring ongoing care. The numbers were staggering, and they represented less than half of the dogs from the compound. Many remained behind when the operation had collapsed into chaos, their fates unknown as local authorities took control of the site following Volkov's official intervention. Speaking of the border agent, Volkov had sustained a gunshot wound to the shoulder during the confrontation, but refused evacuation to continue coordinating with the authorities who had responded to Brandon's leaked footage. His true agenda, the weapons smuggling investigation, had merged with the animal rescue operation in ways none of them had anticipated. The compound manager was killed during the firefight, Volkov informed Jake, his arm now in a makeshift sling. 2 security personnel in custody. Hargrove escaped with most of his team, and the evidence from the sub-level facility partially secured. They destroyed much during their retreat, but enough remains to establish links to international trafficking networks. Volkov's expression hardened. And to confirm your suspicions about experimental testing, these were not simple meat farm operations. A young local volunteer approached, her face streaked with tears and mud. "Sir, the family who loaned us their barn for the wounded dogs, they've received threats. Men came to their home an hour ago." Jake felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The ripple effects of their operation were spreading beyond their ability to control. Innocent locals who had provided assistance were now targets for retaliation. "Move the most critical cases to the transport vehicles," he ordered. "We need a more secure location immediately." As they began the difficult process of relocating injured animals, Jake sought out the older German shepherds rescued from the special kennel, his unit's dogs from Afghanistan. Including Sarge, they had been kept separate from the others, their military training making them potentially dangerous in their traumatized state. Jake found them huddled together in a horse trailer, maintaining the pack structure they'd established during captivity. Sarge, despite his own injuries, had positioned himself as sentry by the trailer door. His eyes tracked Jake's approach with the focused intensity that had once made him an exceptional military working dog. "Hey, partner," Jake said softly, approaching with deliberate movements. "Remember me?" Recognition flickered in the dog's eyes. Not the exuberant greeting of a pet, but the measured acknowledgement of a fellow soldier. After a moment's assessment, Sarge shifted position, allowing Jake to enter the trailer. The reunion should have been triumphant, finding his canine partner after years of believing him dead. Instead, it felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what these dogs had endured. The physical scars were obvious surgical incisions, evidence of restraints, muscle atrophy from confinement. The psychological damage would take longer to assess. A commotion outside drew Jake's attention. One of the local volunteers was arguing with Melissa, their voices rising with urgency. "We can't move him. The internal bleeding will... We have no choice if we stay. Those men will return." And they won't just threaten next time, Jake joined them, finding them standing over a large shepherd with a bandaged abdomen. "What's the situation?" Melissa's face was drawn with fatigue and ethical conflict. "This dog needs surgery. We can't perform here. Moving him could kill him. Leaving him behind will definitely kill him." The nearest veterinary hospital, 2 hours away, across the border. He might not survive the journey. Jake recognized the impossible calculation, the same one he'd faced in combat. No good options, only variations of loss and risk. Prepare him for transport, he decided. I'll drive personally. With you monitoring, stabilize him as best you can. As they worked to secure the injured dog for transport, a local child approached the makeshift hospital area, clutching something against her chest. Her mother followed anxiously behind, trying to call her back. The girl stopped before Jake, her small face solemn as she revealed what she carried: a German shepherd puppy, no more than a few weeks old, its eyes barely open. "From the farm," the child said in halting English. "They throw away, not good for tests." The puppy was severely underweight, trembling with weakness, one paw deformed, a reject from the breeding program. Discarded like trash, Jake knelt to the child's level. "You saved this puppy's life," he said gently. "That was very brave." The mother approached, speaking rapidly in Ukrainian. Brandon translated. "She says there are more." A whole litter was thrown in the ravine behind the compound. Her daughter found this one still alive. Another impossible decision. Their resources were already stretched beyond capacity, every vehicle overflowing with critical cases, medical supplies running low, team members operating on no sleep for over 24 hours. "We'll find them," Jake promised. Knowing the cost of that promise even as he made it, the local volunteer who had earlier reported the threats stepped forward. "My family has a root cellar, hidden. We can take mother and puppies there." Jake studied the woman's face, recognizing the courage it took to make such an offer when retaliation was a real possibility. "The risks are mine to take," she interrupted firmly. "Some things are worth the risk." As they coordinated this new rescue effort, Melissa approached Jake privately. "We have another situation. The euthanasia medications are running low. We have at least a dozen dogs who won't survive and are suffering severely." The unspoken question hung between them: how to provide a humane end when their means were exhausted. The ethical burden of these decisions weighed heavier with each passing hour. "We'll use what we have for the most critical cases," Jake decided. "For the others, I'll—" He couldn't finish the sentence. But Melissa understood. Field euthanasia. Quick, relatively painless, but brutal in its necessity. Another weight for him to carry. The decision was interrupted by Brandon's urgent call. "Vehicles approaching, not locals. Professional security detail." Jake scanned their vulnerable position. Injured dogs everywhere. Exhausted volunteers. Limited defensive options. Evacuation protocol. "Charlie, critical cases first. Leave nothing with identifying information." As they scrambled to load the most vulnerable animals, the Ukrainian volunteer, who had offered her family's root cellar, made a desperate suggestion. "The forest path behind the meadow, too narrow for vehicles. We can move the dogs on stretchers." It was their only viable option. Jake organized teams of 2 volunteers per stretcher, carrying dogs too injured to walk. Melissa distributed the remaining medical supplies among the teams, prioritizing pain management above all else. "What about the evidence?" Brandon asked. "Securing his camera equipment. The footage "Upload everything now," Jake ordered. "Multiple secure servers. If we're compromised, the truth still gets out." The retreat into the forest began as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Jake and Sarge took the rear position, covering their withdrawal. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the solemn procession. Humans and dogs united in suffering and determination. As they moved deeper into the woods, Jake heard the crackle of radio communication behind them. Their pursuers had reached the abandoned field hospital. Discovery was inevitable. The question now was whether they could reach safety before being overtaken. The tragedy unfolded in slow motion, the knowledge that some of these injured animals would not survive the journey, that some volunteers might face retribution, that the hundreds of dogs left behind at the compound faced uncertain fates. Their rescue operation, conceived with righteous purpose, had descended into a desperate fight for survival. Yet in the midst of retreat and loss, Jake witnessed moments of profound humanity, volunteers refusing to abandon the animals in their care, even at personal risk. Local families opening their homes despite threats, Melissa working tirelessly to ease suffering when cure was impossible. These small mercies wouldn't redeem the larger tragedy, but they reminded Jake why the mission, however compromised, however costly, remained necessary. Some battles were worth fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. The forest path narrowed as Jake and the rescue team pushed deeper into the wilderness, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. Slanting morning light filtered through the canopy, revealing exhausted faces and the haunted eyes of dogs who had never known kindness until today. They had traveled nearly 4 miles, carrying injured animals on makeshift stretchers. When they reached a small clearing bisected by a shallow stream, "We need to rest," Melissa declared, kneeling beside a German shepherd whose breathing had become increasingly labored during their flight. "Some of these dogs won't survive another hour of movement." Jake surveyed their position, assessing defensibility with the instincts honed through years of special operations. The clearing offered visibility in all directions. The stream provided water, and the dense undergrowth could conceal their presence if needed. 20 minutes, he conceded. "Brandon, status on the uploads." Brandon checked his satellite phone, the only reliable communication they had remaining. 80% complete. Signals weak here." He hesitated before adding, "But some footage has already reached my editor. She's confirmed receipt and is preparing to broadcast within the hour." A small victory, but Jake took little comfort in it. Evidence reaching the outside world wouldn't help the dogs suffering before him now, or the volunteers whose lives had been upended by their involvement. "Someone's coming," whispered one of the Ukrainian volunteers, pointing back toward the path they had traveled. Jake signaled for silence. Positioning himself between the approaching sound and the wounded animals, Sarge moved to his side, body tense and alert despite his own injuries. A figure emerged from the trees, Volkov, his shoulder bandage now soaked with fresh blood, face drawn with pain and urgency. "You're being flanked," he said without preamble. "2 teams, moving to cut off your route to the border. Professional contractors, not local security." "How did you find us?" Jake demanded, suspicion flaring despite their previous cooperation. "I placed a tracker on your medical kit," Volkov admitted without apology. "Insurance. It served its purpose." Before Jake could respond to this revelation, Volkov continued, "There's something you need to see." He produced a tablet, displaying security footage from what appeared to be the compound's sub-level facility. The timestamp showed it had been recorded just hours before their raid. The footage showed Hargrove in conversation with another man, older, distinguished, wearing a general's uniform. Jake recognized him immediately. General Malcolm Westfield, current Deputy Director of Military Research and Development. "The network goes higher than we thought," Volkov explained, wincing as he shifted his injured shoulder. "Your Colonel Hargrove was middle management at best. The operation has Pentagon connections, unofficial. Deniable, but real." Jake struggled to process this revelation. Not just a rogue former officer running an illicit operation, but potential sanctioning from within the military hierarchy itself. The implications were staggering and explained the sophisticated security and clinical equipment they'd encountered. The dogs weren't just being sold, Volkov continued. The breeding program, the experiments they were developing, enhanced canine units for combat applications, drugs to increase aggression, pain tolerance, stamina. Your military dogs from Afghanistan were the control group proven performers against which to measure the improvements. Melissa joined them, her medical training allowing her to immediately grasp the horror of what Volkov described. That explains the particular patterns of scarring, the systematic tissue samples, the neurological testing equipment. The betrayal cut deep. These dogs had served honorably, saved human lives, only to be subjected to torturous experimentation by the very institution they had served. "There's more," Volkov said. "When news of your raid reached them, contingency protocols were activated. The remaining dogs at the compound—" A distant explosion interrupted him, the sound rolling across the forest like thunder. They turned to see smoke rising above the tree line in the direction of the compound. "They're eliminating evidence," Volkov concluded grimly. "And witnesses." The meaning was clear. Any dogs left behind were now gone. The weight of this knowledge settled over the clearing like a physical presence. Lives they might have saved, had their resources been greater, their planning more comprehensive. One of the Ukrainian volunteers collapsed to her knees, sobbing quietly. She had family in the village nearest the compound, people who might have been caught in whatever contingency protocol had been enacted. Jake knelt beside the young volunteer, placing a hand on her shoulder. There were no words of comfort equal to the moment, so he offered presence instead, the silent acknowledgement of shared grief. Brandon's satellite phone chimed, drawing their attention. "My editor," he reported after checking the message. "The initial footage has hit major networks. International reaction is building. Border authorities from 3 countries are converging on the region." "Too late for those still at the compound," Jake said, the bitterness in his voice unmistakable. "But not for these," Melissa countered, gesturing to the injured animals around them. "And not for justice. The evidence is out. Names, faces, connections. It can't be buried now." Jake wanted to share her certainty, but experience had taught him how easily powerful interests could redirect narratives, obscure accountability, transform clear evidence into ambiguous controversy. The dogs they'd saved today might find healing, but the system that had exploited them remained largely intact. Volkov interrupted these thoughts with practical urgency. "The pursuit teams will reach this position within 30 minutes. You need to move." "These dogs can't be moved again so soon," Melissa protested. "We'll lose at least a third of the critical cases." The impossible calculus of triage confronted them again. Who to save? Who to leave behind? Jake had faced similar decisions in combat, but they never became easier, never felt just. "I can delay the Eastern team," Volkov offered. "Create confusion, false trails, perhaps buy you another hour." "Why would you risk that?" Jake asked. The question that had lingered since their first meeting finally spoken aloud. What's your stake in this?" Volkov's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. A brief glimpse of personal pain quickly masked. "My son was military police. His service dog saved him during a border incident 3 years ago. 6 months later, the dog disappeared from their base. I tracked it here." He gestured toward one of the German shepherds resting near the stream, an older male with distinctive white markings on his chest. "Too late to save him. The experiments had already—" Volkov didn't finish the sentence, but the dog's condition spoke for itself: partially paralyzed hind legs, surgical scars covering much of its body. "Ivan recognized me when you brought him out," Volkov continued. "Not as he once was, but enough to know I had not abandoned him." The revelation transformed Jake's understanding of the border agent's involvement, not just professional duty or moral obligation, but a personal quest for justice or perhaps redemption. "The northern route is your best option," Volkov continued, already moving back toward the forest path. "There's an abandoned lumber camp 3 miles ahead. Defensible position. Road access for evacuation when reinforcements arrive." Jake wanted to offer thanks, acknowledgement, something to mark the unexpected alliance forged in this crisis. But Volkov had already disappeared into the trees, leaving only his tracker on the ground, a final gesture of trust. They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, volunteers supporting each other as fatigue threatened to overwhelm them. The most critical cases were prioritized, carried on stretchers improvised from jackets and branches. Those dogs able to walk moved slowly alongside their human rescuers, a ragged procession united by shared trauma and determination. As they traveled, Melissa moved from animal to animal, administering their dwindling supply of pain medication, whispering gentle encouragement to those struggling to continue. She had been awake for over 30 hours, had performed emergency procedures under impossible conditions, had made life and death decisions that would haunt her for years to come. Yet she persisted with quiet competence, her compassion undiminished by exhaustion. Brandon maintained his documentation despite his own fatigue, capturing moments that would soon reach millions of volunteers carrying dogs twice their body weight through difficult terrain. Melissa, performing emergency treatment with improvised tools. The silent communication between Jake and Sarge as they scouted the path ahead. These images would eventually become iconic representations of both human cruelty and compassion 3 hours into their forest journey. Tragedy struck in its most inevitable form. A young female shepherd, one Melissa had been particularly concerned about, began seizing violently. Despite immediate intervention, the dog's injuries proved insurmountable. As the seizures subsided into stillness, Melissa sat beside the animal, stroking its fur as life faded from its eyes. "Her name was Liberty," said the volunteer who had been carrying her. "I decided that during our walk, she deserved a name before she died." The simple dignity of this gesture, naming the unnamed, moved through the group like a current. Soon, each volunteer was giving names to the animals in their care, transforming anonymous victims into individuals with identities, survivors, warriors, beings worthy of the sacrifice being made to save them. They buried Liberty in the forest, marking her grave with stones arranged in a simple circle. No words were spoken. None seemed adequate. But each member of the team placed a hand on the grave before continuing their journey, a moment of silent witness to one life among many lost to systematic cruelty. As they approached the abandoned lumber camp Volkov had mentioned, Jake's satellite phone received a series of messages from contacts in various agencies: Border Patrol, international animal welfare organizations. Even military channels, Brandon's footage had created the response they'd hoped for. Evacuation resources were being mobilized. Medical teams were en route. But the most unexpected message came from a secure military channel Jake hadn't used since leaving service. Silverback compromised. Harrow protocol activated. Shepard assets to be secured. Coordinates follow. Jake recognized the operational language immediately, an official extraction order for military working dogs, using old code names from his unit. Someone within the system was responding to the exposure, attempting to contain the damage by securing the most incontrovertible evidence, the dogs themselves. The question now was whether this represented justice or another attempt at cover-up. The answer would determine their next move, and potentially the fate of every dog and human in their care. The abandoned lumber camp appeared through the trees as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing, its weathered buildings a main lodge, several smaller cabins, and a large equipment shed stood as silent witnesses to human enterprise now reclaimed by nature. For Jake and his exhausted team, it represented something close to salvation, defensible shelter, protection from the elements, and a centralized location for the medical care their canine refugees desperately needed. "Melissa, set up triage in the main building," Jake directed as they approached the perimeter. "Brandon, establish communications from the highest point you can find. We need to coordinate with the incoming support teams. Everyone else, secure the dogs in the smaller cabins by condition critical cases together for easier monitoring." The Ukrainian volunteers moved with remarkable efficiency despite their exhaustion, carrying stretchers into the buildings, organizing water from a nearby stream, creating bedding from whatever materials they could salvage. Hours of shared struggle had forged them into a cohesive unit, their communication now happening through glances and gestures as much as words. Inside the main lodge, Melissa transformed the dusty common room into a field hospital, using metal tables and countertops as examination surfaces. The remaining medical supplies, pitifully few after hours of emergency treatment, were arranged with methodical precision. Triage markers created from colored fabric scraps designated each animal's status: red for critical, yellow for serious but stable, green for those likely to recover with basic care. Too many red markers, too few treatment options. Jake found her kneeling beside a large male shepherd with extensive surgical scars across his abdomen, carefully cleaning wounds that had reopened during their forest journey. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes following her movements with a trust that seemed impossible given what humans had previously done to him. "His name is Justice," Melissa said without looking up. The volunteers named him seemed appropriate. "Bam." Jake knelt beside her, noting the professional detachment in her voice, a physician's defense mechanism against overwhelming emotion. "How many will we lose before help arrives?" She continued her methodical cleaning, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion in her voice. 7, maybe 8 without proper medical intervention. 3 won't make it regardless. The brutality of these numbers lives reduced to statistics was a necessary part of crisis management, but it never became easier to bear. Each dog represented years of suffering, a brief moment of rescue and hope, and now, for some, an end that came too soon despite their best efforts. "I keep thinking about the ones we left behind," Melissa continued, finally meeting Jake's eyes. "The ones in that explosion." Before Jake could respond, Brandon burst into the lodge, satellite phone in hand, face animated with urgency. "You need to see this. It's everywhere, every major network, social media, international press. He held up the phone, displaying a news broadcast showing their rescue footage intercut with official statements. The headlines scrolled across the bottom. International scandal: military dogs trafficked for experimental testing. The broadcast cut to a Pentagon press conference where a spokesperson was already implementing damage control. These allegations are deeply concerning and completely contrary to Department of Defense policies regarding the treatment of military working dogs. We have launched an immediate investigation. Another channel showed Hargrove being escorted into a federal building, his face partially concealed but posture unmistakable. A third displayed congressional representatives calling for emergency hearings. The exposure was complete, exactly what they'd hoped for when Brandon began documenting the mission. Yet Jake felt little triumph. Media coverage and official statements wouldn't save the dogs still fighting for their lives around them, wouldn't undo the years of suffering, wouldn't guarantee that similar operations wouldn't continue elsewhere under deeper cover. "There's more," Brandon said, switching to another feed. "The message you received about Silverback and extraction protocols. It's legitimate. Military veterinary teams are inbound, specifically tasked with securing and treating the recovered service dogs." Jake absorbed this development with cautious optimism. Official military involvement brought resources they desperately needed, but also complications they couldn't afford: questions of jurisdiction, chains of evidence, potential conflicts with Volkov's investigation. When first helicopters should reach us within 2 hours. They're bringing plasma, surgical equipment, medications. Brandon trailed off as he noticed Melissa's expression, relief battling with the knowledge that 2 hours would be too late for some of their charges. As if to emphasize this reality, a young volunteer appeared at the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "The small one with the white paws, she's going. The doctor should come." Melissa gathered her remaining supplies and followed without hesitation, the weight of another imminent loss visible in the set of her shoulders. Jake watched her go, recognizing the particular burden she carried: the healer who couldn't heal enough, fast enough, completely enough. Left alone, Jake finally allowed himself a moment of private reckoning. He sat heavily on a dusty bench, body aching from exertion, mind cycling through all that had transpired since that first anonymous tip with photos of German shepherds in transport cages. The mission had evolved beyond anything they'd anticipated, revealing layers of corruption and cruelty that extended into institutions he'd once served with complete conviction. Sarge approached silently, resting his graying muzzle on Jake's knee, a gesture of companionship that bridged the years of separation. The dog's eyes held no recrimination for the abandonment in Afghanistan, no visible trauma from the years of experimental abuse. There was only the steady presence that had once made them an exceptional team in the field. "I should have found you sooner," Jake said quietly, running his hand over the dog's scarred head. "I should have looked harder." Sarge's response was to press closer, his weight a solid comfort against Jake's leg. The simple forgiveness in this gesture, if forgiveness was even the right concept for a bond that transcended human notions of blame, broke something open in Jake's chest. For the first time since the mission began, he allowed himself tears, not many, not long, but genuine release. The moment was interrupted by Brandon's return, his expression reflecting new urgency. "Volkov's back. He's wounded worse than before." They found the border agent leaning against the porch railing outside, his shirt soaked with blood from a reopened shoulder wound and a fresh injury to his leg. Despite his condition, his attention was focused entirely on the leather messenger bag clutched against his chest. "The evidence," he explained as Jake helped him inside. From the sub-level facility, research protocols, funding documents, communication records. He placed the bag on the table with careful reverence. Names, dates, connection points to military and private contractors. You went back to the compound, Jake asked, already opening their limited medical supplies to address Volkov's wounds. The contingency protocol was incomplete. Volkov replied, wincing as Jake examined his shoulder. They destroyed the dogs, the obvious evidence. But the administrative offices were only partially burned. Corporate arrogance, they believed their encryption would protect their most sensitive data. As Jake treated the wound, a through-and-through gunshot that had fortunately missed major vessels. Volkov explained how he had circled back to the compound after delaying the pursuit teams. Using the chaos of the official response as cover, he had accessed the partially damaged administrative building and recovered hard drives and document caches from a reinforced safe. Your Colonel Hargrove is merely one node in a network that spans multiple countries, Volkov continued, his voice strained but determined. This operation has been running for nearly 7 years, processing over 2,000 dogs through this compound alone. The scale was even greater than they had feared. Not just their unit's dogs from Afghanistan, not just the hundreds they had discovered in the raid, but thousands over years, a systematic enterprise of exploitation that had operated with apparent impunity. The military extraction teams will want this evidence, Jake noted, securing a bandage over Volkov's wound, which is precisely why I brought it to you first. Volkov replied, your military has conflicting interests in this matter. Some elements genuinely wish to recover their service dogs and prosecute those responsible. Others wish to contain exposure of official involvement. Jake understood the implicit question, who to trust with evidence that implicated high-ranking officials in multiple governments. The incoming military veterinary teams represented help their dogs desperately needed, but potentially also an effort to control the narrative, limit accountability to a few sacrificial individuals like Hargrove. The decision was complicated by the arrival of Melissa, who emerged from one of the smaller cabins with the weight of another loss evident in her posture. We lost 2 more, she reported quietly. Internal injuries too severe. There was nothing we could do except make them comfortable at the end. She noticed Volkov's condition and immediately shifted into medical assessment mode, checking Jake's field dressing with professional efficiency. The incoming teams need to know what to prepare for, she said. Exact conditions, specific injuries, priorities for treatment. Brandon can coordinate that. Jake decided. You need rest before they arrive. Melissa shook her head, fatigue visible in every line of her body, but determination undiminished. I need to document everything while it's fresh, each injury pattern, each evidence marker on these dogs. If this reaches legal proceedings, and it must, the documentation needs to be unimpeachable. Her instinct was correct. The rescued dogs were not just victims requiring care, they were evidence of crimes that powerful interests would prefer to minimize. Proper medical documentation now would establish the truth in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed later. As the sun set completely, casting the camp into darkness relieved only by battery-powered lanterns, the team continued their work with quiet determination. Volunteers moved between cabins, monitoring the injured dogs, offering comfort through gentle words and careful touches. Brandon coordinated with incoming support teams, transmitting medical information and location coordinates. Melissa documented injury patterns with methodical precision, creating a record that would eventually become central to international investigations. And Jake, together with Volkov, examined the evidence recovered from the compound, piecing together the structure of an operation that had trafficked military working dogs across 3 continents. The documentation revealed a network that extended beyond Hargrove, beyond even General Westfield, implicating officials in multiple branches of government and private military contractors with billions in defense contracts. This will disappear if handled through conventional channels, Volkov observed as they organized the most damning evidence. Too many powerful interests involved. Then we create unconventional channels, Jake replied. Brandon's media contacts, international animal welfare organizations, multiple redundant exposures to prevent any single point of containment. The sound of approaching helicopters interrupted their planning, rotors beating against the night sky as powerful searchlights swept the clearing. Military extraction had arrived, bringing with it both the medical resources their dogs desperately needed and the complications of official involvement. As the first helicopter touched down, Jake made his decision. He selected the most critical evidence documents, the ones that created undeniable links between the trafficking operation and official military research programs, and sealed them in a waterproof packet. This he entrusted to one of the Ukrainian volunteers, a quiet woman who had demonstrated remarkable courage throughout the mission. "If anything happens to compromise this operation," he instructed her, "ensure these reach Brandon's editor in New York. The routing information is inside." The woman nodded once, tucking the packet into her clothing before joining the other volunteers preparing the dogs for medical evacuation. Jake watched as uniformed military veterinarians entered the camp, equipment cases in hand, moving with the focused efficiency of battlefield medical teams. Help had arrived at last for the rescued dogs, bringing expertise and resources that might save those still clinging to life. Yet, as he observed the operation unfold, the careful triage, the controlled documentation, the systematic processing of each animal, Jake recognized that the greater battle was just beginning. The evidence they had uncovered threatened powerful interests across multiple countries. The pursuit of justice would face obstacles more formidable than armed guards or forest terrain. But looking around at what they had accomplished, dogs receiving proper medical care, evidence secured through multiple channels, international attention focused on abuses long hidden, Jake allowed himself to acknowledge that this mission, whatever its costs and compromises, had created the possibility of change, not victory, not yet, but a beginning. They called them just dogs. But we know better, don't we? Like the loyal companions who've shared your lives. These German shepherds served alongside our sons and daughters in combat zones, saving countless American lives. Then they were betrayed, abandoned, experimented on, treated as disposable by the very institutions they served faithfully. Jake Sullivan's journey to rescue these forgotten heroes echoes what many of you understand deeply, the sacred promise we make to those who serve. Remember how we felt when our Vietnam veterans came home to silence instead of parades? These dogs suffered that same betrayal. Their story is about more than animal welfare. It's about honor, about keeping our word to the vulnerable who cannot speak for themselves. It reminds us of the America we were raised to believe in, where sacrifice is rewarded with loyalty, not exploitation. Each rescued German shepherd represents a small battle won in the larger war for decency and accountability. When Jake reunites with Sarge, his long-lost partner, we're reminded that some bonds transcend time and trauma. Some promises are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. These are the values we must pass to our grandchildren. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.